Welcome to the English Epics channel. I had 2 shots of whiskey to brace myself for what was shaping up to be an epically bad weekend, and it wasn't even 3 p.m. on a Friday that I work as a reporter for a small newspaper in the Midwest. Having worked several late nights in a row, my boss had generously given me Friday afternoon off. After running a few errands, I headed home, hoping to take a good nap in my favorite chair. But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw 2 cars parked there. One belonged to my wife of 7 years, Tracy, and the other was unfamiliar. It struck me as odd that Tracy was home in the middle of the day. She worked as an actuary at a mid-sized insurance company and usually kept a steady 8 to 5 schedule. And then, of course, there was the second car. Still, trusting the love of my life and believing we had a great marriage, I made no assumptions as I unlocked the front door. But then my world fell apart. From our bedroom upstairs came unmistakable sounds of 2 people engaged in passionate and intense sex. The door must have been open, as they clearly weren't expecting visitors. I could hear the moans, the cries, and the unmistakable slapping. Damn it. I climbed the carpeted stairs 2 at a time, and as I neared the bedroom, the sounds became unmistakably clearer. "Is this what you've been missing? Is this what that small-time husband of yours can't give you?" shouted a man whose voice I didn't recognize. My wife, Tracy, responded with increasingly louder moans. When I reached the bedroom door, I saw her lying on her back under a man who looked like he could play linebacker for the Packers. Her legs were wrapped tightly around his waist as he moved with incredible force. "Give it me, Derek, give it to me," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. What I saw was enough to make my stomach churn. It wasn't just the betrayal but the realization of what it implied. Tracy had never mentioned feeling unsatisfied in our marriage, but her reactions and his presence painted a different picture. My mind raced with a mix of shock and nausea as I tried to process the scene. "Don't stop on my account." "Carry on," I finally shouted, stepping into the room. Calmly, I opened the closet, pulled out my gym bag, and began packing a few changes of clothes. Derek hesitated for a moment, but Tracy froze as soon as she noticed me. The room fell into an uneasy silence, except for the sound of my zipper closing as I walked out. "Oh, Simon, I'm so sorry you had to see this," Tracy shouted from beneath the man towering over her. "We were going to tell you, really, we didn't want you to find out like this." "And when exactly was that supposed to happen, Tracy?" I replied, my voice steady but cold. "On our 10th anniversary. Clearly this isn't a one-time thing. You could have found a moment to tell me earlier if you actually cared." Though Derek had stopped moving, he was still on top of her, and she awkwardly tried to peek out from beneath him as we spoke. "Don't worry, Tracy," I said calmly. "I'm just here to grab a few things. I won't get in your way. I'll come back in a few days for anything else I need. In the meantime, I'll have my lawyer start drafting the papers. By the way, who the hell is this Neanderthal you're entertaining?" She actually chuckled. "Funny enough, Derek's my lawyer. He works for one of the big firms downtown." "Great," I said flatly. As I walked out of the house, I didn't bother closing the front door. I tossed my belongings into my Ford F-150 and drove straight to my favorite bar. Not exactly the best way to start the weekend. On a weekday, most bars are empty, and the Rusty Fork was no exception. Even my favorite bartender, Noel, wouldn't start his shift until 4. So I just sat there in my usual spot, lost in thought. I suppose I should have seen this coming. The last time we went to one of my wife's work events, her colleagues barely hid their disdain for me. By the end of the evening, I could sense she was starting to agree with their judgment of my career and my ability to provide the kind of lifestyle she wanted to get used to. Tracy never hesitated to point out that her job paid twice as much as mine. That night on the drive home, we had a sharp discussion about her behavior. She brushed it off, blaming it on having had a little too much to drink. I didn't like that explanation, but since I'm not one to hold grudges, we made up a few days later, or so I thought. And now, here I am, sitting in the bar. I know I probably should get up, go home, and transfer half of our money into an account solely in my name, but right now I just don't care. My credit card is in my name alone, which means I can spend the rest of the evening getting thoroughly drunk and then pass out in my pickup truck. Tomorrow I'll find a hotel or an apartment. Tracy and I met at one of the largest universities in the Midwest. We dated during our junior and senior years before I proposed to her. We both knew that if I couldn't land a job at a major newspaper in a big city, she would likely always earn more than me. Still, we agreed that everything we earned would be ours, not hers or mine. At least that's what I believed until recently. I'm not sure how much her change in attitude is tied to her colleagues, but it's clear that she's completely lost respect for me. As for her love, well, today made it abundantly clear where I stand. Noel greeted me when he arrived at 4 and seemed a bit surprised to see me so early. I gave him the Reader's Digest version of my day and handed him my truck keys with strict instructions to load me into the cab when I was done for the night, but not to return the keys until I sobered up the next day. Tough break, man, finding out like that, he said as we talked. By around 9 in the evening I was thoroughly numb, emotionally and physically, when a state police officer walked into the bar. He approached Noel at the counter and asked if Mr. Simon Tillerson was present. Noel, of course, pointed him in my direction. The officer walked up to me, very professional, I thought in my hazy state, and said he had some unfortunate news to share. My wife and a certain Mr. Derek Biggs had been killed about 3 hours earlier when a semi-trailer ran a red light and plowed into Mr. Biggs's BMW convertible. The authorities had been trying to find me for 3 hours before one of my acquaintances told them about my favorite bar. Well, I'll be damned, I shouted. Drinks for everyone on me. There is a God in heaven. My declaration was met with applause. Officer Reginald Masters looked as if he'd just seen a ghost. I don't think he expected a newly widowed man to react with such joy. Mr. Tillerson, I understand you must be in shock, but... Shock. No, buddy, it's euphoria, I yelled in my drunken state. The reason I'm this wasted is that earlier today, I caught those two fooling around in my bed. I was planning to leave that cheating witch to hell with her corpse. It couldn't have ended better. The officer still looked stunned. I didn't care. Normally we prefer for the next of kin to identify the body to ensure it's the right person, but I don't think Mr. Tillerson is in any condition to help tonight, Masters said to Noel. Could you make sure someone gets him the message that he should head to the morgue tomorrow? Noel nodded. I may have been completely hammered, but I fully understood what was happening and what Masters had just said to me. And while I knew I would probably miss my wife once I sobered up, she had betrayed me and planned to replace me. So at that moment, my anger toward Tracy outweighed any lingering love I might have felt for her. The next morning I woke up in the cab of my pickup truck, stiff and sore. I probably looked like hell too, but I staggered back into the bar to grab my keys and head to a hotel. Then I remembered what the police officer had told me the night before and decided to go to my now empty home, thinking about Tracy and the 9 years we'd spent together, 7 of them as husband and wife. What saddened me most was how it all ended. I can't say I truly grieved because, even though I was no longer drunk, I still felt a grim satisfaction that she and that bastard had gotten what I believed they deserved. At home I took a shower, cleaned myself up, and headed to the morgue to identify the body. Tracy's body looked battered, unsurprising, given that a semi-trailer had plowed into their convertible. I asked to see the second body as well. Derek looked just as broken as Tracy. I found myself hoping his death had been slower, just for the irony of it. Back at home I knew I had to make at least 3 phone calls, one to my parents, one to hers, and one to her sister Anna. Somewhere deep inside, I understood that I felt sorry she had died, but at that moment, every thought of her was tangled with the memory of her pleading with her lover to give it to her. I couldn't muster any genuine sadness for her. So I decided I would handle it the only way I knew how, focus on the facts and avoid letting my emotions cloud the task ahead. At the very least I felt sorry for Ron and Cindy Jacobs, Tracy's parents, over the loss of their daughter. I loved Ron and Cindy almost as much as my own parents, and I certainly didn't want them to suffer. From that perspective, the situation was complicated. I called my parents first to share the news. My mom, the more emotional of the two, immediately broke into tears. My dad, on the other hand, started asking questions, and I explained that Tracy had been in the car with Derek Biggs at the time of the accident. "Who is Derek Biggs?" he asked bluntly. I knew the question was coming, but I still hesitated before answering, which probably told him everything he needed to know. An attorney. "A friend of Tracy's," I replied. "My dad is a sharp and insightful man." He didn't miss a beat. "So why was she in a car with her attorney friend when she should have been at home with you?" "Because she wasn't with me anymore, Dad. That's why," I said. "Earlier in the day, I caught her and Derek having sex in our bed. I'm guessing this wasn't their first time. So I threw some clothes into a bag and left. I don't know why they were in the car around 6. Judging by the time, I assumed they were heading out to dinner." "Well, damn son, I'm sorry to hear that." By this point, my mom had calmed down a bit and rejoined the conversation. She'd heard enough to piece together what we were discussing. "Are you sure she was having sex with another man, Simon?" I mean, that's not something you say unless you're absolutely certain. I cut her off, not bothering to sugarcoat my response. Mom, I caught them in the act. After all these years, I've had enough experience to know exactly what I was looking at. Have you talked to Ron and Cindy yet, Simon? My dad asked. If not, what are you planning to say to them? As little as possible, Dad, unless they start grilling me like you are. I'm not going to lie, if that's what you're suggesting. Well, that could make things messy, son. Just remember, they're family. Show them the respect they deserve. Yes, sir, I replied solemnly. The phone call with Tracy's parents was eerily similar to the one with mine. While her mom was absolutely devastated, my father-in-law quickly picked up on the fact that at the time of her death, Tracy had been in the car with another man when she would usually have been with me. Are you leaving something out, Simon? I heard Ron's voice, steady but tense, as Cindy sobbed in the background. At 6 o'clock on a Friday, Tracy should have been with her husband, but instead she was in a car with another man. That doesn't add up, son. Fine. Fine. I half shouted, half growled into the phone. Tracy was cheating on me. I caught her in bed with the guy she died with just a few hours earlier. I packed my things and left. I guess after that they figured they had nothing left to hide and decided to go out together. Why, you caught them. Together? In bed? In your house? Ron asked, his disbelief evident that it was hard for him to accept that the daughter he just learned had died, could have betrayed her husband and died in a car with her lover. Yes, Ron, yes. And right now I'm so angry at her that I'm actually glad they're both dead. That woman and her lover got what they deserved. I knew I shouldn't have said that last part to her father, no matter how true it felt. He started yelling at me over the phone until I cut him off, quiet but firm. He mocked me, Ron, while he was with your daughter, and she went along with it. She even begged him for what she thought he could give her, yes, your daughter, and my wife. I guess this saves me the trouble of divorcing her. She won't be buried in my family plot, and I certainly don't want to rest next to her when my time comes. So just tell me the name of the funeral home your family uses, and I'll make sure her body is sent there. I'll handle that part, including the financials. The rest, like the funeral arrangements, is up to you and Cindy. Needless to say, I won't be attending. You can't just pretend she didn't mean anything to you, son, Ron said in his most calming tone. You were together for nearly 10 years. You can't tell me that all of that can simply be erased. I can, and it is, Ron, I replied. We ended the moment I saw her with Derek Biggs in our bedroom. Why should her death change how I feel? Someday, eventually, you might feel differently and regret not saying a proper goodbye, Ron said, his voice almost a whisper. I don't think so, I responded just as quietly. The funeral service was held at Ron and Cindy's home church, the very place where Tracy and I had vowed before God and both our families to love, honor, and cherish each other. The irony wasn't lost on me. I considered attending for about 10 seconds before a surge of anger bubbled up inside me. Have you ever wanted to strangle a dead person? Because I sure did. While my presence at the funeral might have made things easier for Tracy's parents, it would only have fueled my own anger, and trust me, I already had more than enough of that about an hour after I figured the service was over. Tracy's sister Anna called. I knew the conversation wouldn't be pleasant, but it seemed like she needed to get something off her chest, especially if her parents hadn't told her the whole truth. Tracy was right, you're a piece of garbage. A small man with small dreams and a small you-know-what. You write small stories for a small-town paper, and you have a small future. I've always wondered why she didn't cheat on you sooner. Good day to you too, Anna, I replied to her charming greeting. So I take it you knew all along. Then tell me, if I was such a terrible guy, why did you even want me there? Because you humiliated my parents, you piece of garbage. How is anyone supposed to answer the question of why Tracy's husband wasn't at her funeral? My parents practically died of embarrassment when they had to explain to the Reverend why you didn't come. You're trash, and I hope you die too. Now you're getting it, Anna, I yelled back into the phone. That's exactly what I thought about your sister and her lover when I caught them together. And you know what? I got lucky. They actually did die. So why don't you just back off and leave me the hell alone? I thought the conversation went rather well. I hired a realtor and immediately put the house up for sale. I moved my belongings into the spare bedroom and sold all the furniture from our master bedroom, including the sheets and pillowcases, at a bargain price. I had no intention of ever touching those things again. As for Tracy's belongings, I took her jewelry, most of which I had given her as gifts, and sold it to a local jeweler, donating the proceeds to a church food pantry. Her clothes and everything else I packed into boxes and delivered to her parents, telling them they could keep or dispose of them as they saw fit. Among the boxes were our wedding album and the usual small photographs couples keep of one another. I didn't need any photos of Tracy. I had more than enough in my memory. The last one of her with Derek Biggs in our marital bed was something I would never forget. Ron and I made small talk while he helped me unload the boxes. When the last box was offloaded, I looked at Ron and Cindy, and they looked back at me. We embraced tightly. I'm sure we were all crying. "Take care, guys," I whispered when my voice gave out. All of this was done within the first 2 weeks after Tracy's death. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I got a call from Cruz Miller Insurance. Tracy and I had always carried life insurance, so I knew why they were calling. It just hadn't been a priority for me while I was dealing with everything else. Now that the obvious tasks were done, it was time to call them back. Tracy, as a professional in the insurance field, had always handled our insurance matters. We discussed everything together, but since it was her area of expertise, I let her make the final decisions. One of those decisions was a $1 million life insurance policy for each of us, with a double indemnity clause for accidental death before the age of 45. That meant I was due a $2 million payout. But then the insurance agent mentioned something that nearly made me choke on my coffee. It appeared that, because the truck driver was at fault for the accident, his company was liable to provide a wrongful death settlement, unless I decided to take them to court and sue for everything I could get. They would cover both Tracy's and Derek's deaths. The agent suggested I settle for no less than $2 million, though she believed the situation warranted closer to $3 to $4 million. After the lawyer took their share, I ended up with $4, $75 million in the bank. At that point, I didn't even care. I was completely numb. The trucking company also settled with Derek Biggs' widow, and the signing of the agreements was scheduled to take place at the same time and location. I had never met Derek's widow before the signing, and while I'd always considered Tracy a beautiful woman, Derek's widow was at least equally stunning. I couldn't help but wonder why he would risk his marriage for an affair. I figured maybe he was so confident he wouldn't get caught that he didn't see the risk in it. After we signed the paperwork with the company, Ellie Biggs invited me for a cup of coffee. It seemed she had one unanswered question about this whole ordeal, and she hoped I could provide the answer. "My husband didn't have a client or friend named Tracy Tillerson that I know of," she said, and after checking with his firm, they confirmed she wasn't one of his clients. Yet they were in the car together when they died. No one at Derek's office knows who this woman is, or if they do, they aren't telling me. "Who was your wife to my husband, Mr. Tillerson?" I took a big sip of my coffee. Damn, I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news to this remarkably attractive woman that I lowered my eyes to the table in the Starbucks where we sat. "Oh, this isn't good," she said, almost to herself. "Please, Mr. Tillerson." I deserved to know the truth, so I told her the whole story from my perspective. She looked absolutely stunned. Suddenly, I felt deeply uncomfortable. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, standing up from the table and leaving the coffee shop. Despite being wealthy by most people's standards, my life felt like a mess. I had no interest in dating. I moved into a dingy 2-bedroom apartment just to have a roof over my head. I had few friends, and I didn't care. I worked at the newspaper, rode my bike a lot, and lifted weights a few times a week. I was merely existing. My father, bless his soul, eventually convinced me to see a therapist. The diagnosis? Trust issues. The therapist suggested I get out more and try to build some semblance of a life. It was a waste of time. I never scheduled another session. And so, there I was, sitting at home, watching baseball and just thinking, this time replaying the conversation I had with Anna 6 months ago, after Tracy's funeral. She had said I wrote small stories for a small town paper, and she was right. I'd taken that job because it was the only opening at a paper near Tracy's workplace. Since she earned more than I did, I sacrificed my plans to move on to a bigger paper someday, waiting until Tracy decided it was time for us to relocate so I could start looking again. But now I had no ties to anyone. In fact, I might not need to work another day in my life. I was free to come and go as I pleased, write whatever I wanted, and not care if anyone read it. The next day I went to my boss, Ernie, and handed him my 2-week notice. Sitting in my apartment one evening, I glanced at my so-called library. It consisted of about 30 books, 28 of which were nonfiction. One of the 2 fiction books was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. That book got me thinking, a risky activity for me, according to some. In school, one of my strengths, as per all those ridiculous tests they make you take, was abstract thinking. Before the age of internet hyperlinks, I constantly practiced this skill in my head. I would take a thought, examine it, twist it slightly, and then move in a different direction. It served me well, but my friends often struggled to follow my train of thought during deep conversations. They quickly learned never to ask, "What if?" when I was around. 10 minutes later, it hit me, Tracy would always be my white whale, and I had to hunt her. But I would do it through the written word. That's how it all started. I sat down at my computer and wrote my first piece of fiction since the 8th grade. The character based on Derek Biggs met an untimely demise, while the character inspired by Tracy faced brutal punishment from life itself. It took me 2 full days to write, edit, and polish the story, but for the first time in 6 months, I felt alive. I still couldn't punish Tracy in real life, but in my mind, through the story, I could. Over the next 2 months, I wrote 17 more stories, changing the plots but keeping a couple of constants. The Derek character always met his end, and the Tracy character always got her comeuppance. Damn, it felt so satisfying to finish a story, set it aside for a while, and then come back to read the completed product. Then I turned back to Moby Dick. It was a real book with a cover and bound pages. I can do this, I thought to myself. Yes, I could, and I did. 6 months later, I had my first novel, historical fiction piece, of all things. Naturally, the Derek character was killed, quite gruesomely, and the Tracy character was humiliated once again. I thought it wasn't bad, and apparently a publisher agreed. The deal I got wasn't great, but at least I didn't have to pay for self-publishing. I don't know how it happened, but other people liked the book too. The publishing company went for 2 more print runs. They wanted a second book and even doubled the advance, so why not? I wrote another. This time it was a murder mystery, and yes, the Derek character was the victim, while the Tracy character was caught and sent to prison. Once again, finishing the book left me feeling much better, and the strong sales didn't hurt either. It seemed like plenty of people out there shared my feelings about Tracy and Derek. After the success of my second book, another publishing company approached me with an offer for a 3-book deal, paying me twice as much. Considering that I was already a wealthy man, though no one knew it, I didn't need the money. Instead, I gave my first publisher the right of first refusal to match the offer. They quickly agreed, so I stayed with them and delivered 3 more books over the next 18 months. Each book followed the same basic storyline, though I varied the settings and plots. For the 3rd book, I even experimented with a bit of humor. All 3 became hits, but what mattered most to me was that I continued to feel better with each completed book. I knew I'd never get all the answers to my questions about what she had done and why, but writing these books brought me a sense of closure, as close to satisfaction as I could get. As the old song goes, love the one you're with. I signed another 3-book deal with the publisher, and once again, the payment doubled. This time, they had even bigger news. A film studio wanted to adapt at least 2 of the books into feature films, offering an incredible amount of money. They even wanted me to help with the screenplay. Why not? Of course, I said. Although I was never a big fan of Oprah Winfrey, her endorsement of a book usually launches the author into the stratosphere of success. When she chose my 6th book as one of her book club picks, I experienced it firsthand. It was incredible. Not only had I become a successful author, but I also gained public recognition. Of course, there was a downside to that, but I suppose it's the price of success. For the most part, people were polite and kind, but every now and then I encountered some jerk determined to prove they weren't impressed by me. That's fine, because I wasn't impressed by them either, and I don't tolerate nonsense from anyone. I can dish out a sharp retort as well as the next person. So there I was, sitting in my favorite bar, the same one where the cop told me Tracy was dead, simply enjoying a Friday evening with my good buddy Jack Daniels. My net worth now exceeded $10 million, but I still enjoyed the simple things in life: a good drink, working out, cycling, and occasionally spending time with a pretty woman. I still lived in the same dingy apartment and wasn't looking for anything serious in the romance department. A few of the regulars at the bar probably knew about my writing success, but for the most part, everyone left me alone. Sure, there was the occasional playful jab, but nobody talked about reading my work. Honestly, I figured about half of them couldn't read anyway, so they weren't exactly my target audience. Noel, my favorite bartender, was aware of my success. We occasionally talked about it or what I was working on, but he was a good guy and, as far as I could tell, kept his mouth shut. Of course, the fact that I left him a $20 tip every time I came in probably helped with that. I was watching the TV screen closest to me, listening to the background music, and generally ignoring the world around me when two women suddenly appeared beside me at the bar. Both were attractive, about my age, early 30s, and dressed casually in jeans and simple tops.